Charles Murray is one of the most important public intellectuals of the last 50 years. And he spent almost all that time as a typical cold, logical atheist, the kind that dismisses faith as a comforting delusion. But something has turned in Charles. He has a new book, Taking Religion Seriously, in which he writes things like, "I live in a universe that was intentionally designed to permit the development of life." It's a book aimed at fellow cold, logical atheists like me.
You were the target audience. Almost you specifically. You, Rob, who, of course, is a really hard case.
Why does he think the Shroud of Turin points towards Christianity being literally true?
I promise you, we're looking at hardcore chemistry and science.
How has he witnessed the power of prayer in his own life?
And I did pray earnestly, and in the next couple of days, whatever I was worried about went away. And it scared the bejesus out of me, as it were, not because prayer didn't work, but because it did.
And why is he seriously considering trying psychedelics?
I've been advised by people, including people who are quite religious, to do exactly that. That psychedelics can...
Really?
Yes. Specifically the mushrooms.
Okay, so in the opening of your book, you write out the anti-religious catechism that most college kids are subjected to and in turn converted to over the course of their 4 years, primarily at elite universities. And this is what the catechism is. The great religious traditions are human inventions, natural products of the fear of death. That includes Christianity, which I can call on no solid evidence for its implausible claims. When you wrote that out, I felt seen. I felt seen, Charles. Thank you. You established an emotional intimacy very early in the book. As just groundwork, how much of your life have you spent subscribing to that specific catechism?
Oh, I guess about from age 18 to about roughly 50 years old. And so that 50 years old would put me at 1993. And I guess that's a pretty good demarcation line for when I was starting to edge out of that. But it took a very long time. So if you're talking 1993, that's more than a quarter century before I was willing to sort of say, I guess I'm pretty much a Christian.
What was the activating event that got you to at least begin to incrementally move away from it?
At that point, my wife, Catherine, had been going to Quaker meeting since 1985, 86, which she started to do right after the birth of our first child, Anna. And I will tell you the reason that she started going, because it was kind of key to everything else. She decided that she loved Anna far more than evolution required. And by that, she was saying, in effect, I understand evolutionary psychology, and I know that mothers better love their babies or else they aren't going to pass on their genes, etc. And she felt that she was being a conduit for some larger love from some mysterious source that pointed vaguely toward God. And she, therefore, she shared my secular catechism at that point. Like me, we had both been raised Protestant and drifted away. And so she started to try to go to mainstream churches, but she couldn't, in good conscience, recite the Nicene Creed, the Apostles' Creed, and she ended up in Quakerism, which is very non-doctrinaire. Well, so she's been going to Quaker meeting for several years. I have watched her take a lot out of this, of value to her, and I've watched her developing a faith. And at that point, I was beginning to think that maybe I ought to be taking this more seriously. But it was a very slow process. Another event that happened shortly after that was Charles Krauthammer at a meeting of the Pariah Chess Club. Pariah Chess Club was named that after the bell curve came out. Charles thought it was an appropriate name for a club that had me as a member. Used the Heidegger's phrase, why is there something rather than nothing? And that just really struck me. I mean, I should have run into it a lot earlier, but I hadn't. And so from there, I was beginning to see this as a question I had to address. Why is there something rather than nothing? And I didn't think that the easy answers in my secular catechism cut it.
But Charles is a good person to bring up because you knew him personally as a friend. I know him as someone who just admired him as the single greatest opinion columnist of the last 30 years, right? Mm-hmm. Master prose stylist, an ability to do something in 800 words that very, very few people can do, right?
Absolutely agree.
And Charles, Krauthammer, super smart. Maybe makes a good point about why is there something rather than nothing. Maybe indulges a little bit in arguments related to fine-tuning. But he himself, insofar as I know, died a non-believer.
He also died a person who said that the least plausible of all the explanations of the universe was simple atheism. So he did think, and this is pretty much where I was initially, that there is a mystery out there. And it's sort of the question, is it a mystery with a small m, M that you don't have to think about, or is it a mystery with a capital M that you do have to think about? And I know I went the latter route.
I think the reason the book that you wrote is so good, specifically for someone like me,
you were the target audience. Almost you specifically. Not quite, but almost.
You know I'm in a moment of spiritual transition right now. That's not fair. That's not fair. Where it's a certain kind of hyper-educated person wants to have things rational, wants to things to be under control, maybe has a certain native condescension for people that don't think as rationally about the universe, and grew up in some sort of institutional religious tradition, but yes, imbibed the catechism in college and kind of takes that as the standard issue explanation for why are these people praying to the sky gods? Mm-hmm. What's the reason for this? And that person, if they're going to be converted in a core conviction, such as, is there or is there not a benevolent intelligence behind the universe? You need to speak the language that they know, which is one of rationality, which is one of evidence. And we'll get into some of the evidence that you provide. Mm-hmm. But you're self-aware of this in the book, that because the book, though, is built to communicate at that level of understanding the universe, the frontal cortex, the rational, what's based on evidence, you can compile the evidence and compile the rationality and have the pieces click into place for Christianity up here. But that's very different than like feeling it at a soul level, right? And your wife feels it at a soul level. It vibrates within her. And the end of your book is, I don't know if I want to say it's depressing, but you at least openly acknowledge the fact, I've just put together all these pieces for why Christian metaphysics are correct. It's all up here. The puzzle pieces are there, but it has a hit in here.
That's correct. The thing I would add to that is that I present what I did as the second best option. And the reason I use the second best option, which is the one which talks about empiricism and the historicity of the Bible and the rest of that, the reason I do that is because I have a spiritual capability level, which if it were expressed in the IQ metric would be retarded, 60, 65, something like that. I don't think that I contribute anything original to this book, except sort of semi-original is my focus on spiritual perceptiveness as a trait. The same as musical, the ability to absorb music is a trait. The ability to look at great art and take away from it deep emotion, so forth, is a trait. And not everybody has it. there is such a thing as tone deafness. That includes some people with very high IQs. There is a museum goer like me who goes to a great museum and is looking at great works of art. And I know enough to be able to look at them and see there's wonderful technique there and this and that. I spend 15 seconds looking at it and I walk on to the next one. And other people can stand in front of that painting for 20 minutes and see new things all the time and be moved by it. Same thing is true of spirituality. The thing is that people who have a very low spiritual capability tend to think that nobody has real spiritual capability and that they're making it up.
Yeah.
And I didn't have that option because the one I was watching was my wife, who you know. And as you know, she has an extraordinary intellect and she's completely self-possessed of realism and self-understanding. And so if she is taking a lot out of that, things that I can't see, my root assumption has to be, I don't get it because I'm not able to get it. But if I wanted to follow her at all, I just had to use the tools that are accessible to me, and those involve empiricism. And that's the route I took. And so what I would say to people like you is, look, I suspect you probably are on the retarded end of the spectrum too, and I can't take you out of that, but I can persuade you, if you will bother to look at the material, that there's some real important things for you to take on board on your frontal cortex that maybe sooner or later will percolate down to your gut.
Right. As the lay of the land, before we get into you as fellow 60 IQ spiritual retards, is being at a moment in which I can sense the things that there is something outside of that narrow framework. I have motivated reasoning to subscribe or believe in those things, but I'm not doing it yet. I cannot do it yet. And the most parsimonious explanation is your explanation that I have a retarded spiritual IQ, which might be the conclusion of that we come to after an hour together. So let's get into it. What is it about the Big Bang and the physical laws of the universe that leads you to write, I live in a universe that was intentionally designed to permit the development of life?
This is the best example to start with because we are talking about hardcore physics. And what I'm about to say is not physics as promulgated by people who are also religious. The book that first impressed me was written by a person who is non-religious, Martin Rees, Astronomer Royal, Great Britain. And it's called Just Six Numbers, very slim little book. And he is describing just some of the characteristics of the physics of the first second of the Big Bang that are bizarre. And they are bizarre because they are not parameters that are motivated by theory. They are just things that exist because, as physicists sometimes say, they are brute facts. There are six of them that he deals with. There are more than a dozen that others have found. One example, you take the ratio of the electrical forces binding the atom, which are vastly, vastly stronger than the force of gravity, about 10 to the 36th power. Size that ratio. Well, if that ratio were a little smaller, so the gravity was a little more powerful, then galaxies might form, but the stars would burn up in 10,000 years, which is way too soon for life to exist. And some of the other numbers in this collection of anomalies are ones which say, if that number had not been precisely right, the universe would be nothing but constant radiation. With another number, if that one hadn't been set just right, the universe would be black holes, nothing else. The Nobel laureate, Roger Penrose, calculated the chances that this universe that we live in, that does permit life, would exist by chance, and it is 1 in trillions. That number he is using mathematically, not illustratively. 1 in trillions. Okay, so here you go. I will put it to you. You have 3 choices. First, the physicists, kind of desperate to come up with a non-religious explanation, have postulated multiple universes. And a lot of string theory and the rest of this goes into it. There is not a shred of empirical evidence that they're right. The whole string theory phenomenon is deemed by many physicists, including Roger Penrose, to be close to scientific quackery. But that's one of your options, okay? Also, you have to go outside and look into the sky tonight and say, oh, there are probably 1 million of these universes out there, which doesn't sound real plausible to me. Your second choice is to say, hey, it's a 1 in trillions chance, but we're here, so what's the point in worrying about it? Or your third option is to say the parsimonious, plausible, empirically appropriate conclusion is that the universe was created with an intention that we may not fully understand, but among that intentions was that it permit life. So I found myself just saying, I can't believe I'm believing this, but I am, after I got done with that book.
The multiverse theory, which basically says there's an evolutionary process, right, of different universes that have different, these base level physical constants set at different levels.
Mm-hmm.
And through some elaborate, it's not even it's in some arena that's not being specified, these universes are competing for survival with one another. And inevitably that leads to the universe that's habitable.
They don't interact at all.
I guess the one that survives is necessarily going to be the one that is permittable to human life.
Well, no.
Yeah.
They're saying there are 1 million universes out there. One is some are all radiation, some are all black holes. The only problem is for new universes to be created, you have to go back to the temperatures that existed in the first brilliance of a second of the Big Bang, temperatures of unimaginable magnitude. And you have to say, if you start from a singularity that is dimensionless, where the hell do those temperatures come from? And if you tell me it's a quantum burp, I'm sorry, it just doesn't pass the smile test.
Okay, so we're going to go. That's with you making the argument that there's something like intentionality to the universe,
yes.
And as we dig down deeper, we'll start having you try to attach potential personality characteristics to that intentional will, or whatever we want to call it.
As long as our listeners understand that the process was not nearly that systematic. I mean, I'm sort of meandering in the garden here, and I come across various things at various times. And they develop over a period of months or years. Okay, so that's what really happened.
There's no meandering here. We're moving inevitably in lockstep either towards full-blown Christian conversion in this podcast studio within an hour.
Okay, I'll do my best.
Yeah. You have a section of the book that's about psi phenomenon, and I'm going to have you define what those are in a second. But you write, I think the body of scientific work has demonstrated the statistical reality of psi phenomenon. So what is it? How would you describe it to someone who's maximally skeptical of its existence?
Mm-hmm.
And then provide for me the best evidence you can that you think there's a there, that it's not just infomercial hoaxes and psychics on Oprah.
Psi includes ESP, extrasensory perception. You have different words for different. There's clairvoyance, which is seeing things in the future. There is knowledge at a distance, whereby people can describe buildings or situations that they've never seen before. There is psychokinesis, which is the ability of the mind to move objects. You've got a whole bunch of them. And there has been a century of systematic work on identifying and measuring them, starting out with J.B. Rhine's famous flashcards with their 5 different symbols on them and trying to guess what the flashcard is that somebody else is looking at, trying to guess what this image is going to be on the next card you turn over. The early attempts to prove the existence of psi also included the British Psychical Society for the Study of Psychical Phenomena, which had some very famous scientists as its president, also had William James as president, and accumulated thousands of case studies. A lot of this was debunking mediums and other kinds of, there were lots of hoaxes and lots of bad stuff in this, but a lot of that was debunking, but they were also collecting systematic qualitative accounts. Now, if you go back to the quantitative work, which was initially quite primitive, there has been much more sophisticated work done since then, a lot of it. And I give titles of a couple of the major compendia of the most rigorous scientific evidence. As far as I'm concerned, the result of these quantitative efforts, the most important result is that it answers the binary yes-no question. Is there any validity to any of the psi phenomena? And I base that on findings in that quantitative work, which passed rigorous tests of statistical sophistication and methodological sophistication. The problem is one that just has plagued this study from the beginning, which is the most impressive examples, case studies, come in moments of extreme stress, and you can't study those in the laboratory. The case study is really your only way out from that, and case studies are subject to a variety of quite legitimate skepticism, reasons for skepticism. The two areas, well, there are actually three areas where I think the evidence is runs from suggestive to extremely strong. Carl Sagan had this famous pronouncement in one of his books that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, I think that in the case of near-death experiences and of terminal lucidity and childhood memories of previous lives, you are getting real close to extraordinary evidence. We don't have time to go through all those in detail. I will put aside the childhood memories because that does not necessarily go to the question I want to concentrate on. The question I want to concentrate on is, do we have evidence that consciousness can exist when the brain stops functioning? Because a great deal of religion hinges on the assumption that consciousness can exist when the brain stops functioning. The existence of human souls, the existence of life after death, all of that hinges on some reason to believe that's possible. Most people have heard of the near-death experience literature. I will simply say, in a summary sense, the databases of cases of that now number thousands of cases. We have studies that are prospective studies, that are not after the fact. We have studies which have controlled for just about everything it's possible to control for. The most powerful cases are ones that meet these criteria. First, they occur in clinical death, meaning no heartbeat, no respiration, no activity in the brainstem that can be detected. That's one criteria. Really good, solid evidence that there's no reason for the brain to be functioning anymore. The second criteria is that something idiosyncratic happens at a place where people are working on the patient. A lot of them report, near-death experiences often report a tunnel and people go through the tunnel and there's a light at the end of the tunnel with a being that's radiating universal love. No way to verify that. But if something weird happens in the operating room or the emergency room or at the scene of the accident, while the person is clinically dead, that they then later accurately recount, That's pretty good evidence. And the thing is that you then have to verify, there has to be thorough documentation that this idiosyncratic event occurred. I think that at this point, once again, the parsimonious explanation is that consciousness somehow persisted. Terminal lucidity is in some ways even stronger evidence. There are people who have advanced dementia, have not recognized their spouse or children for years, have not said an intelligible word for years, have all the characteristics of advanced dementia, which means essentially the networks for speech and language and communication, they're destroyed. They aren't damaged, they're destroyed as networks. In a matter of hours before they die, you have cases where suddenly these people are back. They recognize their spouse. They recognize their children. They have memories. They ask about events that betray memories of past events. They have their personality characteristics. And this lasts maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour, 2 hours, and then they go right back into the dementia and they die. Well, in this case, the criteria have to have clinical evidence of the advanced dementia. And that's not a hard thing to have. And the second thing is there have to be witnesses to the relatives. Oftentimes it's relatives who are there, but you want a case where there's a medical personnel also who attest to the accuracy of the accounts of relatives. And if those two conditions apply, it seems to me that's really powerful evidence as well. So that's how I end up saying, I think psi phenomena points to an important feature of religious belief, and that is it enables the possibility of a human soul and afterlife.
In as concrete terms as you can, what's an example, either in the real world that actually happened that you read about, or a hypothetical example that matches what you've read about these near-death experiences that you think the features of which can actually be rigorously scientifically investigated? Like a specific thing that happens that has observers to it,
Sure,
that can't be explained by traditional materialist scientific philosophy.
Well, the one that I found kind of amusing is a person who was clinically dead, and after he's resuscitated, he's asked him why was the surgeon making these, acting like he was flapping wings, and it turns out that the surgeon in question, after he's wearing his hands are sterile and so forth, to avoid touching anything, when he was trying to indicate to a nurse or another physician, he would point his elbow out at that thing, and it looked like he was flapping, had wings that he was trying to flap. Okay, where did that come from? In another one that's not quite as amusing as that, a person came out of that kind of clinical death, and during the time he was dead, the nurse had taken his dentures and placed them in a specific drawer of a specific cabinet or something somewhere in the operating room. The guy comes out of the thing and he's recovering, and he points over to that cabinet and says, "Get my dentures out of there, would you please?" And pointing to the specific drawer where the dentures have been put. Okay, how did he know the dentures were there? It's that kind of thing. But it's not just those two examples. I'll give you one third one, which does not involve clinical death. This happened to a man named Bruce Grayson, who subsequently became an expert on near-death experiences and terminal lucidity, too, for that matter, and is at the School of Medicine at the University of Virginia, where they have a department dealing with this. Anyway, he was talking to a person outside the critical care ward, and he had a stain on his tie. He had a stain on his tie from spaghetti. And inside the critical care ward was a patient who was in a deep coma, who Bruce Grayson had also interacted with before. The next day, Bruce Grayson goes into the ward to talk to the young woman who has come out of the coma. And she says, where'd you get that stain on your tie? And as Bruce Grayson says, and this is in the introduction to one of his books, he said, I have spent the next 30 years trying to figure out how she did it in my tie.
Yeah.
There's a lot of material out there. Some of the cases of terminal lucidity, particularly those from the 19th century, when clinicians did this sort of thing, will be multiple pages of very detailed descriptions of the episode of terminal lucidity from a strictly medical perspective.
I don't want to have my skeptical questions just be reinforcing the idea that my spiritual IQ is very low in the double digits, but I feel like I owe it to myself to at least articulate one or two, because I'd imagine I know you. You've thought about them yourself, right? And none of this is debunking. We're not here to debate. I lost interest in debating questions about 4 years ago. We're here to explore the vast complexity and mystery of existence in all facets. But, okay, you have these kind of edge cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
But so much of day-to-day life seems to indicate there's a very clear one-to-one correlation between what's happening in your brain, what's happening in your consciousness, and some underlying physical reality of the 3 pounds of meat that are in your head.
Mm-hmm.
You suffer a head wound, something changes in your consciousness. The chemicals get off balance. There's changes in your mood. There's so much of what we see seems to be that these two things actually are very much connected. And perhaps a skeptic might say, we don't understand the precise way that this thing called consciousness is housed on top of the 3 pounds of meats on our brain, but we will eventually. And while Charles might be able to provide a couple strange edge cases that are not clearly explicable today, we'll be able to do it eventually. And the operating assumption ought to be that we can, because there's all this other evidence that indicates these two things are essentially the same.
First place, we do not have to throw out neuroscience in order to investigate these issues. You can say that neuroscience explains a huge amount of the function of the brain, correctly describes that in the same way that Newtonian physics correctly describes the movement of physical bodies very accurately, sort of within the normal range. Now, where Newtonian physics breaks down is at the quantum level and at the macro level. And in both of those cases, Newtonian physics doesn't work. And I compare where we are now with where physics was after the Michelson-Morley experiment in the 1880s, I think it was, which provided very firm evidence that the speed of light did not behave as Newtonian physics said it should. And it was simply an anomaly that needed to be explained. And eventually it was explained. The theory of relativity explains the results of that experiment. Now, it is possible, it's always possible, that eventually these gaps will be filled in. But in the meantime, you have to ask yourself which involves the greater degree of invincible, unquestioning faith. And I'm saying that your statement that eventually it'll figure out how to do this is a statement of faith. And what I am doing is saying, I don't see how it's possible to explain consciousness, the return of memory and of personality and of speech in a person with advanced dementia if physiologically the neuroscience tells us that all the parts of the brain that do this sort of thing are no longer functional. That seems to me to be taking the empirically conservative approach And you are being a wild-eyed idealist, assuming that eventually all this stuff will get fixed. And I would add further, you can consider the very powerful case for that answer to the binary question I posed earlier. Do psi phenomena exist? And the statistical, in order to say that they don't exist, you have to take incredibly powerful statistical results and just dismiss them. Well, that sounds like faith to me too. There is a thing called scientism, a word that developed in the 19th century because after the Enlightenment, it wasn't just the Enlightenment said that reason and empiricism are really powerful tools. It kind of said they're the only tools that we will admit. And so by the middle to late 19th century, you had some of the characteristics of religion already creep into science. And I would say that a lot of the chief debunkers of all forms of psychic phenomena and the rest of it are heirs to that scientism, who are bound and determined that certain really weird empirical phenomena do not need to be studied because they don't fit within the paradigm we're comfortable.
You do talk about this in the book, specifically using that framework of Newtonian physics, which I guess would be a very scientism way of looking at the universe more broadly, which is the human mind has sussed out and determined very particular physical laws that govern the way molecules in the rest of the world work. And what you specifically have said about physics is that it turns out the world is actually at the molecular level much more mysterious and unknowable than a simple Newtonian physics framework would have you believe, right?
Right.
And I guess a lot of your case, just generally outside of just physics, but just existence, period, is you'd say whatever the neat, simple scientism explanation for how the world works, and maybe it does explain large chunks of existence, simply breaks down when it gets to the quantum level. The quantum level of love, whatever, right? The quantum level of sensation, the quantum level of human consciousness. But that at that level, it's that kind of neat, hyper-rationalist scientism actually no longer matches the reality in that quantum little corner.
As long as everybody realizes we're using the word quantum as kind of a figurative way of talking about weirdness at the molecular level.
Yes.
And quantum mechanics fully meets every definition of weirdness. I love Richard Feynman's characterization. He says, well, it used to be said that only 3 people understand the theory of relativity. And he said, that's not true. Lots of people understand the theory of relativity. I understand the theory of relativity. What I can say with confidence is no one understands quantum mechanics. So you have, particles behaving simultaneously as a particle, but also as a wave. You have particles change state just because of the act of being observed. You have a particle which, if it changes state, instantaneously changes the state of an entangled particle at vast distances away, instantaneously, faster than the speed of light. And as Feynman says, nobody knows how the world could be this way. And so, to me, the reality of that weirdness at the quantum level makes it, again, I'm using an analogy, makes it a whole lot less bizarre to say that similar kind of weirdnesses apply to these phenomena that are extremely hard to explain.
All right, we're building Charles Murray's newfound metaphysics brick by brick.
Mm-hmm. Brick by brick.
So your book is not just there's intentionality behind the universe. Your book is not just I think there is a soul or the ability of human consciousness to exist outside of the brain. You specifically make a case, and I'm putting make a case in quotes because your way of communicating it is not one of crusader vigor, right? specifically for Christianity as an accurate representation of reality.
Mhm.
As part of that, as part of both a reflection of your personality and also your target audience, you go super frontal cortex and start making arguments and amassing evidence. And one of the things you do that for is specifically the Shroud of Turin. Explain what the Shroud of Turin is, perhaps explain why you became fascinated with it, and in your fascination, what evidence you were able to dig up that made you think that it's something worth taking seriously. I'm going to purposely use a very vague term there.
As long as we understand, or these people listening to us understand, that this comes at the very end of a couple of long chapters where there are a bunch of other things about Christianity that I've looked into the empiricists. So this is the final thing. And in all of this, I am relating this, I hate the word journey to describe this, but I'm relating how this process actually occurred with a person like me. I am not proselytizing. I'm saying to my readers, this is how it worked out for me, and I'm an amateur in these areas. I'm not a theologian. I'm not a physicist, and the rest of that. This is the way it looks to me. Shroud of Turin, a piece of linen that is said to have wrapped the body of the crucified Jesus of Nazareth, and it has been in a chapel in Turin, the Cathedral of Turin, now for 5-6 centuries, 7 centuries, and it appears to show the very faint outlines, frontal and dorsal, of a human body. And in 1898, it was first photographed when it was being exhibited briefly. And it turned out that whereas the positive version of the photograph shows exactly the same faint, indistinct outline, the negative of the photo shows a very detailed image of the front and back of a body that has been scourged, penetrated by spikes in the appropriate places, has a whole bunch of characteristics that are consistent with the story of the crucifixion. And these were so graphic that the shroud attracted a lot of scientific curiosity. And by late 1970s, the church had agreed to let it be examined by a team of chemists and physicists and other specialists from the United States. And it was called the STURP team, the Shroud of Turin Research Project. And they published their findings in a technical journal, Analytica Acta Chemica, volume 135, in 1982. And I assure everyone, you can get that article online. Go to a website called shroud.com and read it. I promise you, we're looking at hardcore chemistry and science in particular, general. That we're not talking about starry-eyed priests who are trying to make a case for the Catholic Church. It is an incredibly baffling article. It was an incredibly baffling problem for the authors of the report. Of the many baffling things, 3 were especially baffling. And one was there is no pigment or paint of any known kind on the shroud. None. So whatever a medieval forger might have used, it wasn't those. Second, this is even weirder, the image, the points on the image are directionally neutral. Now, any kind of human-created image, however small the brushstroke may be, is going to, at the microscopic level, will have a directionality to it. Not so the shroud. The third thing, and the really, really baffling thing, is the incredible superficiality of the image. The points of tint, if you want to call them that, are no more than 2 to 3 microns thick. A micron is a millionth of a meter. And if you have a fiber that is 12 microns deep. The tint only penetrates the first 2 or 3 microns, and the rest is uncolored. You can have 2 fibers side by side, and one will have that superficial coloring. The adjacent one will not. As the authors of the technical report say, we think we understand what the image is chemically. It is not just that we don't know how it was created. We have no hypotheses that fit all the facts that we have uncovered. We do not have any proposed candidate explanation left. Now, there are a bunch of other things that are weird about the shroud, but the thing that many listeners are probably saying to themselves, but wait, they did a carbon dating on the shroud, and it was shown that it was 800 years old. The same lead author for the technical article reporting the findings originally in 1982 came back and re-examined the sampling of the shroud, and they did another chemical analysis of it, which is published in a technical journal, and the conclusion is that the sample taken was not part of the original shroud. That did not get nearly as much publicity as the original announcement of the dating to 800 years ago. And just to wrap all this up, there is another way of dating the shroud, which is based on the deterioration of cellulose in the linen that dates it a couple of thousand years old. Now, that is a new way of establishing age of something, and I'm not going to go to the wall for the validity of that. I think that still needs to be reinforced. I am just saying that you might as well give some attention to the Shroud of Turin just because it is intellectually fascinating. And it also is an important add-on to what I consider the much more undisputable aspect of the whole resurrection story, which is that something really powerful happened on Easter, the first Easter, that you had 12 Palestinian manual laborers, probably all but 1 or 2 of whom were illiterate, and who had been following their leader, who had recently been subjected to a brutal death, a humiliating death. They were afraid for their lives. There is every reason to think they were not just demoralized, but shattered in the days after the crucifixion. A couple of weeks later, they are back, utterly confident, enthusiastically, charismatically, and very effectively preaching the story of the resurrection. And I'm saying, I don't know exactly what happened, but don't tell me that they just sat around for a couple of months and slowly this grew on and then maybe this happened. No, something really dramatic and powerful happened on Easter. So that's the kind of exploration that I did on lots of different aspects of the New Testament.
Let me press you on this then.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you're like me, most of your life spent in the anti-religious catechism, right? These are all made up fairy storytale. These are fairy tales that people tell themselves because of otherwise incomprehensible things like the inevitability of death and human suffering.
Mm-hmm.
You start inching your way towards some religious conviction. And it starts with these fine-tuning arguments related to the fact that the universe can even have life, in combination with psi phenomenon that seems to indicate that there's something much funkier going on with human consciousness than a strictly materialist
That's the word I was searching for, funkier.
It's funky. And then there's the lived experience of just living life and loving children or listening to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, right? Which have these ethereal features to them that don't seem accounted for in a very, vacuum-closed materialist explanation for reality.
Mm-hmm.
So you find yourself opening. But you're trying to retain a certain amount of intellectual rigor, despite yourself, right? That when it comes time to ascribing to a specific religious tradition, you can't make the leap. Someone could theoretically do this. Someone like me, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Where at that stage, your frontal cortex still kicks in. And you say, okay, obviously maybe something very powerful happened on Easter 2,000 years ago in Palestine that got these guys jazzed up. But equally powerful things happened to generate Islam. Equally powerful things happened to generate Buddhism. Equally powerful things happened to generate Mormonism and Scientology. That
I wouldn't say equally.
Okay. And that there's a grand mystery at the heart of the universe. There's something funky going on. And a lot of different people have taken a lot of different approaches to try to take that funkiness and make it comprehensible, to understand it, and then also to develop ways of being that match whatever they think is the ultimate nature of reality. But I, in my newly found, not strict atheism, but, openness to religion, am not willing to go that next step of saying one particular religious tradition is probably right. You do go to that next stage of saying Christianity specifically, you think is more likely than not to be right. I don't know how you want to articulate it. Right?
Yeah, I would say that Christianity has hold of some aspects of what I think are truths that other faiths do not. But I also subscribe to the proposition that many people have that all the great religious traditions are groping toward the ineffable and the unknowable, and they each have hold of some part of that elephant, but it's the same elephant. So there is no real tension in my mind between being a good Buddhist and being a good Christian.
Huh.
There may be some technically theological points of tension, but they're on the same wavelength in so many ways. If you take the great ethical systems that come out of Buddhism and Taoism and Christianity and Judaism, they are all remarkable in terms of their ethical precepts. So I think it's possible to explore these issues and be able to hold a couple of things in your mind at the same time. One is the contributions that are made by the different traditions. And at the same time, there may be one of them that has more meat to it and more penetration than the others. And that's pretty much what I've done. But I would aggregate for you, Rob, who, of course, is a really hard case. For you, I would say, just think of it this way. Around the 6th century BCE, give or take a century on either side of that, you had Taoism, Buddhism, and Judaism all in there, and the Upanishads, actually, in Hinduism. You had these traditions that were all developing profound ways of looking at the universe and the nature of the beings in that universe. And the Enlightenment essentially cut off intellectuals from the riches of all of those accomplishments. And it is time for us overeducated agnostics to say, you know what, it would be good to restore our access to the human wisdom that went into the development of it.
So let's get into specifically you and how you end up concluding the book. Because in the same way that I felt very seen when you were articulating the anti-religious catechism at the opening, I very much felt the way you describe your religiosity at the end of it. I'm not quite as far along as you are, even in the frontal cortex, but I can feel myself bumping into the same thing that I know you're bumping into. So you're self-aware in this book that your religious awakening is mostly happening at the intellectual, evidence-based level, in the rational, logical part of your brain. You explicitly say, in contrast with your wife, I've yet to experience the joys of faith. The question I have is quite personal. You don't necessarily need to ask it. Maybe it's even to the point of asking you to be self-indulgent. But why do you think the conclusions that you're getting up here aren't hitting you at that soul level yet? Do you think they ever will?
I think it's possible they will, but it's not hard for me to explain why they haven't yet. You must understand that for Catherine, all of this study I have done is beside the point. Catherine engages in contemplative prayer. She has read deeply into the literature on meditation and on the ethics and the all sorts of plainly spiritual issues where I am convinced she can read these texts and she can engage in these contemplative retreats and so forth and take stuff away from them that I can't. And I could go back from my earliest youth and give you all the ways in which my personality, hyper-individualistic, have been from earliest memories, that the kind of participating in faith requires a willingness to let go of some of that individuality and enter into a larger spiritual sphere that I'm really reluctant to do. I recount one time when I did decide to try to pray when something had been bothering me, because I don't pray, and I did pray earnestly, and in the next couple of days, whatever I was worried about, don't know what it was, went away. And it scared the bejesus out of me, as it were, not because prayer didn't work, but because it did. And I've always had trouble trying to reach a meditative state because I feel like I'm surrendering some of my autonomy. So everything in me is screaming to not let go of this individuality, and for that matter, the things I can do in my prefrontal cortex, because that's what I'm good at. I have made my career on being good at dealing with evidence and logic and empiricism and the rest of that. So I'm a person who I'm a victim of my environment. Something I find very funny to try to make as a claim. I'm a victim of shortcomings in my personality that get in the way. And here is the kind of unfortunate thing, that a lot of times that leap of faith, that recognition of the God-sized whole, the recognition of these realities, is the product of some profoundly painful experience. That's not true of Catherine. It was the birth of her child, which is a joyful experience, which you got it. But I have a feeling that if I were ever to be in the depths of despair, which I have never been in my life, knock on wood, if I were ever in the depths of despair, I wouldn't be surprised if I had the breakthrough. And I would not attribute the breakthrough to, I'm clutching feverishly at whatever can make me feel better. I'm convinced the breakthrough would be a breakthrough to reality that is currently close to me. So that's why I end with a kind of arid belief that I have achieved, but that has also really been good for my life in many ways. I'm really glad I did it.
I was just in Israel. We talked about it off microphone. And I told you when I went to the Western Wall, I couldn't help myself but say a prayer to a God I'm not sure exists. And I got a little bit of what you got, which is the first couple of days after I was back, I was feeling good. Wild, sleep deprived, totally behind on work, but in my gut, feeling aligned with the universe. I didn't explicitly get scared that it was working. I just naturally fell back on my hyper-ruminating, hyper-intellectual ways and then dragged myself back down. But there was a little like what? I got some, I don't know what this energy is in me. I don't know where it came from.
Listen, I think this should be in the broadcast, by the way. podcast, what you just said, because I'm going to anthropomorphize God in ways that I disapprove of. But suppose you do have this being that is God is love is really meaningful. Love in the sense of agape, the Greek word for a kind of selfless, universal love. Suppose you have a God like that, and he has to deal with some hard cases. And so for some people, the doctrine of transubstantiation, the Catholic Church speaks to them, and they can increase their faith because of that. Suppose God is stuck with the two of us. How is he going to do it? And one of the ways is to pray to a God that you don't know exists and feel better for no particular reason. And you know, it's like the old joke which has this punchline of that God says, I sent you the boat, I sent you the plane, I sent you the helicopter.
Yeah.
After a person says, God, why have you forsaken me? And God may be saying about us, I made him feel good. Doesn't that count for anything?
It's like, dude, you hadn't worked out, you're sleep deprived, you're not properly hydrated, you've been only eating airplane food, and you still feel good, and you don't have an alternative. What's your explanation, bro?
Yeah.
Let me say this, though, actually. This is a funny question, maybe. You could do what generations of hyper-intellectuals that sense what's on the other side, but can't bring themselves to do, just given their base level neurology. You could do what they've all done and what I've done to jump over that little chasm, which is like, just go take some psychedelics in the woods, Charles.
I've been advised by people, including people who are quite religious, to do exactly that. That psychedelics can...
Really?
Yes. Specifically the mushrooms. And I might do it. I did take a couple of doses of LSD in my 20s and did not have that kind of experience, although they're pretty interesting. Yeah, well, actually, I was introduced to them by a guy named Peter the Monk, who was an American, but was quite adept at reaching deep meditative states. And I was so bad at meditation, he finally gave me some LSD. And he said, this isn't nearly as good as the meditation, but it's sort of second best. And that maybe is the theme of the book, that here's the second best way to take religion seriously. Catherine's is the best way. I did the best I could.
Right. I'm saying we can chemically recreate what she just gets naturally if we just go take some mushrooms in the woods. All right. Awesome. That's great. We'll end on that.
Okay. That was a good conversation.
Yeah. That's fascinating.